46. Almost 1 in 2 young people. 86. Nearly 9 out of 10. 51. More than half. Burnt out before they even began. This is the percentage of Gen Z who has reported being so stressed, so anxious, so emotionally overwhelmed that it is interfering with their daily functioning. This is not just a number. These are our children. These are the kids that we are interacting with. I have been navigating 3 worlds in these past 2 decades. The corporate world of HR, the clinical world of psychotherapy, and now the world of education, where I sit every day across to the very people whom we are talking about. And let me tell me that these numbers are not surprising, because I have seen it in the eyes of a 14-year-old girl who cries every morning before she goes to school but does not know why. In the resignation letter of a brilliant 22-year-old who quit 3 weeks into his first job. And in the struggle of 17-year-olds wanting to be understood by teachers and parents alike. So I'm going to do 3 things here today. I'm going to help you understand Gen Z. I'm going to help you to stop blaming them. And I'm going to give you something practical that you can do starting tomorrow. So who is Gen Z? This is a generation that was born between 1997 and 2012. They did not grow up alongside technology, they grew inside it. They have never known a world where there was no social media, no search engines, and no being constantly seen, perpetually, all the time. For them, there is no difference between a life that's online and a real life. It's simply life. They grew up in a global financial crisis. They were handed the internet at the age of 7 with no manual, no safety net, and no adult who could help them deal with what they were navigating. They came into age in pandemic, which robbed them of their milestones, their graduations, their first jobs, their sense of a future. They inherited a planet in a climate crisis, a world in an economic crisis, and of late, a mankind in a humanitarian crisis. And yet, we call them fragile, entitled, can't handle anything. Let's hold that for a moment. Imagine a financial crisis, a pandemic, a climate emergency, a 24-hour news cycle which is telling you that the world is burning, because it is. Ask yourself honestly, at the age of 14, how would you have behaved if you were navigating all of this? Because as a psychotherapist, one thing I have learned is that behavior is communication. Always. When a child acts out, when a teenager withdraws, when a young adult resigns, they are all telling us something. The question is, are we listening? Are we tuned into what they're doing? The clinical term for what Gen Z is going through is complex stress response. It is not a weakness. It is a neurological and psychological response to a very difficult situation. The brain in a chronic stress environment does not function the way a normal brain does. It struggles to regulate emotions. It becomes hypervigilant, and when the pressure intensifies, it shuts down. What we call Gen Z's attitude problem is actually a stress response. It's trauma, and we are not treating it as one. Let me tell you what I mean. 17-year-old, straight-A student, the kind of child parents point to with quiet pride. He got diagnosed with a heart condition, chronic, medically manageable. But the diagnosis caused some shift in him. He withdrew from his friends, his grades started falling. He stopped doing all those activities that defined him. From the outside, it looked like a child being difficult. But what I knew was that this was a child who had already lost too much. 2 years earlier, he had lost his brother to an illness. The family never spoke about it, not once. Grief in that house was not an emotion to be named. It was something you carried in silence and kept moving on. But silence does not dissolve grief. It just drives it underground, where it poisons the soil, quietly, out of sight. What I saw was a teenager who was grappling with the reality of surviving something that his brother had not. A survivor's guilt which had not been witnessed, not been named, and had not been given permission to exist. His parents' response was, he's just acting up, he needs to pull himself together, there's no such thing as depression. They were not cruel people. They were just people whose own grief was unprocessed, who had built their survival on not focusing on their emotions. So they did not have either the language or the framework or even the capacity to hold whatever their son was going through. They had lost one child and might be in the process of unknowingly losing another. This is not a teenager being difficult. This is the story of a family whose trauma went unprocessed and unacknowledged and then finally surfaced in the form of this child. 25-year-old, a client. He was clever, talented, by all professional measures, exceptional. He left his job after 8 months into it. Great company, great salary. His manager was baffled. On paper, it made no sense. But paper was not where this young man lived. He was asked to work late every day, not as a necessity, but as a culture. Weekends were not his own. He had to sit daily in 3-hour meetings, which in his own words, in which nobody was doing anything. Nothing got done, no one was honest, and everyone was performing being busy. That stayed with me, that phrase, performing being busy. Because it captured a clarity of the workspace, something that the Gen Z sees, something that is deeply distressing to those of us who were trained to consider and regard activity as productivity and presence as commitment. We were trained to sit through those hours and hours of meetings. So while we agreed, Gen Z has decided to take a different approach. He wasn't against hard work. He was just against work that was dressed up as urgency and had no meaning. I met him a few months later and he had joined a smaller firm. He had negotiated his own terms, his own boundaries, his own work hours, availability, and he was thriving. He hadn't given up his work ethic. He had just found a work environment which was willing to give him what he needed, to come and meet him at the space where he was. My generation works from a space of fear. Fear of the employer, fear of the mortgage, fear of saying no when everybody's saying yes. Work comes first, always, unquestionably. That was not a choice, that was the job. And Gen Z is the first generation that has grown up watching the result of this bargain in burnt out parents, missed childhoods, and people who had no idea of their identity once they retired. They saw all of this, they saw the cost, and they refused to pay it. They want different things. So while we decided to put employers first, they are putting themselves first. Whereas we performed loyalty, they demand honesty. Where we sat through those 3-hour meetings and to prove our worth, they send the email, close the laptop, they go home. We call it irresponsibility. I call it a generation that is brave enough to finally call out what each of us only ever thought. So yes, I'd also like to speak to the parents. Whenever I speak to a child in pain, I always ask, does anyone at home know? And the answer almost always is no. I don't say this to blame the parent. I say this because I know I have sat with enough parents in enough meetings and enough therapy sessions to know that what a child is experiencing outside is not always perceived in the same manner by the adult, not because they do not care, but because they are a result of completely different worlds. Most Gen Z parents grew up in a world where difficulty had a face. Bullying happened in corridors. Social exclusion happened at the lunch table. If your child was struggling, there was always visible signs. A bruise, a note, a teacher calling home. The pain had a location. It had edges. And you could see it. And in theory, maybe do something about it. That world is completely gone. Nowadays, a 14-year-old can be systematically excluded from every social group she belongs to. And all her parents will see is that she's sitting in her bedroom, apparently fine, on her phone. What they don't know is that phone is the corridor. That phone is the lunch table. That phone is where her social world lives and dies and is replayed and screenshot and shared in real time, without pause, without an end. She is not sitting in her bedroom. She is navigating the most psychologically intense social environment that any teenager has ever had to. And she's doing it alone. The social dynamics of the Gen Z being online is something that is beyond whatever we ever knew. This is an entirely different language. There is the entire landscape of microcommunication. A like that was never given, a story that was viewed but never shared, a social group that went silent because somebody joined. These all carry enormous pressures for them and are mostly invisible to a lot of adults. This is not a parenting failure, but a structural gap that all of us in this room are responsible to make sure that we close it. And it doesn't help that the tools we built are not working. As an HR person, I've seen organizations try to manage millennials with tools that were for baby boomers. It did not work. And now we're doing the same with Gen Z. In schools, we are still holding to the same kind of systems that were there in industrial eras. School, rows, bells, compliances, silences, memorization, and then we wonder why they're disengaged. As a subject trainer, I think the examination culture has failed. We are testing a very small band of intelligence, recall under pressure, and calling it ability. For a generation that grew up with instant access to all the information in the world, to ask them that a mind who can recall a fact is a measure of its ability, it's absurd. And they know it. And that's why most of them check out even before they come to school. As a principal, I see it in a child who needs support, being disciplined, in a child who hasn't spoken a week going unnoticed because the teacher was too busy with work pressure, and where mental health is treated as a separate department. A corridor, a counselor's room down the path, rather than being woven into our teaching fabric. I would like to end from where I began. That 17-year-old who wasn't allowed to share his grief. The 25-year-old who saw a system and did not want to be a part of it. These are not cautionary tales. These are invitations. Invitation to be curious about this generation. Invitation to not be judgmental, but understand that the world they are navigating is most likely much harder, much lonelier than what we were ever asked to go through. And so to reach out to them and look towards them and give them that support that they need. Our job as parents, as employers, as human beings is not to fix them. Our job is to meet them with curiosity, with respect, and with an open mind. because all they want is someone to have their back. And that's what we have to tell them. We've got you. So let's change our mindset from judgment to curiosity, from pressure to presence, and from fixing to building. Thank you.
Thank you.